All right, what's up, everyone? We are back for the next Ekkolapto slash Computational Philosophy Club online salon. Today, I'm here with a very special guest, Niko McCarty, who runs Asimov Press, which I'm sure many of you have already heard about. But in the case that you haven't done a deep dive on what he's working on, a little intro from Niko could be pretty fun if you want to take it away.
Sure. So I'll introduce myself. Um, I'm glad to talk about whatever people want to talk about. So, I spent many years, I guess my background is I spent many years as a bioengineer. I worked on some multiplexed CRISPR tool development a few years ago. Worked on engineering synthetic microbial communities to do like distributed biomanufacturing type projects. Uh, then I went to Caltech. I worked with Rob Phillips on, um, well, my project was to map the E. coli regulome. So the goal was to measure the binding energy of every transcription factor DNA binding site throughout the E. coli genome without doing like beads and pull downs and stuff like that, and instead try to turn it into a sequencing problem. So I was doing things like splicing barcodes into the E. coli genome and then measuring barcode abundances and trying to triangulate that back to binding energies. And um, so I was there for a while. I became very interested in bio numbers and sort of quantitative molecular biology ideas. Um, I dropped out during COVID and I moved to New York and I started journalism school at NYU, a science journalism program. Um, so I was there for 16 months. My first writing job was at Retraction Watch. So my first like serious journalism job was basically reporting on retractions, fraud, some really bad stories that I'd be glad to talk about if anybody's curious. And then I
Yeah, a
joined,
little bit of tea on that one could be interesting.
yeah. Um, One of the stories I broke was there was this guy who was running the Chinese COVID-19 response. He was kind of like the Anthony Fauci of China. And anyway, I broke a story about him touting this supplement as a treatment for COVID, and the supplement company was owned by his son-in-law. And I broke that, and then later, like the Financial Times picked it up, and so that was an interesting one. After that, I joined a magazine that at the time was called Spectrum. It's kind of a neuroscience autism magazine. It's now called The Transmitter. It's owned by the Simons Foundation. So the Simons Foundation runs two magazines called Quanta, which most people have heard about. And then they also run The Transmitter, which most people have not heard about. And I worked at the other one. So I was a data reporter there for a while, which means I built charts and data stuff, and I did some reporting and wrote about neuroscience. And then let's see, I moved to Boston. I joined New Science, a nonprofit called New Science that was started by this guy Alexei Guzzi with some money from like Vitalik Buterin and Jan Tallinn. Um, and the organization didn't have a clear thesis, but I was the head of media, so I basically started a blog. I did that for a while. And then I went to MIT. I built a new undergraduate genetic engineering program with Chris Voigt, not to be implemented at MIT, confusingly, but we were funded at MIT to build this new program that will be established elsewhere. So that just wrapped up. And then I started Asimov Press a couple years ago with funding from a biotech company called Asimov, which was started by Chris Voigt and Alec Nielsen and Doug Densmore a few years ago. And the idea is uh, the original idea was like computational tools applied to genetic circuit design. Uh, and the way they apply that is by engineering mammalian cells for biologics manufacturing. So they build tools like software, cell lines, and stuff, and then they sell that to companies who are manufacturing AAVs, lentiviruses, antibodies, and stuff like that. It's kind of like, uh, and they promise things like boosted titers and whatnot. And I pitched them on, hey, let's start a magazine because I was reading Works in Progress a lot at the time. and I was really interested in like Strike Press. And I said, hey, we should do something similar for biology, like long form, quantitative, weird, esoteric histories of biology and biotech. And Asimov really liked it. They put up the funding. I built a small team in the first year. And then in the last year, we raised some money from Stripe and from Astera Institute to grow a little bit. And so now we have two full-time people. We have a part-time art director, a copy editor, a fact checker, a couple columnists, and we occasionally do print books, and I would like to do more print books. One of them is here. This is our most recent. Um, these are just anthologies, so we haven't done like an original proper book yet, uh, but we're working on that now. So we have our first true original book in development. Um, this book was cool because we got some sponsors to encode it in DNA, and then we sold it with the DNA. So I think it was the first commercial book sold with the book also written in DNA.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so that was made by the DNA was made by a company called Catalog, and Plasmid Source was also a sponsor, and they did the sequencing. So we try to do just like weird, interesting projects when we can. But I'll leave it there. I'm glad, most of my day, I would say, I spend editing. We're always editing many, many pieces at any given time. I'm reading new papers. I'm tweeting stuff, and I'm trying to write my own columns. And that's how I spend most of my time. So glad to talk about publishing, starting a magazine, raising funds to do this sort of weird stuff that has zero chance of ever returning the investments. Um, or just talk about biotech because I spend the vast majority of my time just reading and keeping up with biotech stuff. So,
Well, that would be an interesting thing because I was talking to a couple friends earlier about launching some kind of computational philosophy journal, right? Sort of based on the theme of this club and this community, and it's basically sort of about computationally building ideas from philosophy. So things that sort of exist in the space of philosophy as it stands right now, and how do you actually sort of build things out of it? So one of them is this idea of like biological prompt engineering, which I've talked about in the past, and like what is the philosophy of adaptive learning systems and all these kinds of things. And I guess my first question, just based off of your experience, is going like the route of a journal even the right path for something like this? Because it seems this kind of stuff, because you cover a lot of really interesting topics at Asimov Press, and I was describing them to a friend earlier that it's sort of like you do seem quite interested in some of the edge cases of things in biology that are not normally necessarily talked about, and you have it seems like you've definitely found an audience and people that are valuing what you're putting out. And so I'm just wondering, like, what will this format look like in the future? Because I think this ties directly into the future of research and development, which is now more days happening. You have things like O'Shaughnessy Ventures, Emergent Ventures that are giving large sums of money, for people like me or DVZ or any of us to work on projects that wouldn't necessarily happen in academia. So I'm curious what the future of science communication looks like now that there's this weird middle ground that's happening.
well, it's such a huge question. And it's so strange because even amongst, well, just in the past places I've worked, but also amongst our current funders, there's a huge dichotomy in terms of how they feel about the future of journals. So one of our funders is Stripe and Patrick Collison, who, he also funded Arc Institute. And at Arc Institute, they did not blow up the publishing model. They want to publish in Nature. They want to publish and sell because they think that's the cachet and that's what scientists read. And even if journals blow up in the future and like they can't keep pace with discoveries or whatever people argue about in terms of meta science and the future of journals, I think there will probably always be a place for journals and prestige journals. Um, so I get that. And then our other funder is Astera Institute, which they don't even allow their researchers to publish in journals. They want to blow up journals. Um, so it's kind of like I feel like I've just heard both sides of the discussion just in doing Asimov Press, and I've thought about starting a journal actually in the last several months. And I kind of was workshopping the idea around to people of starting a journal that is only for biological ideas. So it's kind of like Asimov Press, except we wouldn't do the histories. It would just be like edgy opinions because I kind of feel like journals have lost their edginess. And when I read perspectives, it's all very like written by committee, sort of tame, common sense opinions that don't offend anybody. So I've thought about that. I feel like people might be more likely to write for us if it was a journal, uh, and we had an impact factor. I don't know. It seems like people still value that. Um, so I don't know. I would like to see a proliferation of weird journals in the world, and I think there's probably room for that. But at the same time, you probably don't need them if you do things well. It's like right now we're working on getting all of our articles indexed and discoverable on Google Scholar. I don't think almost anybody has ever cited our work, even though I see the inspiration of our work show up all the time. Like I'll read papers and it'll be like very kind of derivative of something we've published months ago or years ago, and we're just not cited because it's like it's not uh, traditional to cite news articles and whatnot. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I don't know. I've kind of fallen on the side, I guess, to answer it straightforwardly. I've kind of fallen on the side that you don't need journals. You can get really great people to write for you if you pay them, and you can amass a huge audience that is actually more influential than most journals if you just do a
Yeah, it's a sort of kind of ground up approach, you could say.
yeah, like Works in Progress has huge
Yeah.
amounts of sort of policy stuff, and they're not a journal. The Institute for Progress, when they release reports, right? Like people really pay attention. So I guess it depends on what your North Star is. And that's something we think about all the time is like, what are we actually trying to do and how do we measure it? And in publishing, it's very, very difficult to measure outcomes that are not clicks, views. Those are the easy things. But if we say our North Star is that we want our coverage to actually change what biologists work on, which is what I want to happen. I want to publish things that I think are important and that actually change people's sort of navigation of the problem space. We often just don't hear about that. Like, how do you measure that? Sometimes you get emails from people, and that's nice, but that's kind of rare. It's very stochastic. I read things all the time that inspire me, and I don't email the author and say, hey, you changed my life. I was talking to Sam Arbesman a while ago, and he said he wrote something. This was years ago. He published something and a student read it and he like dropped out of a program and re-enrolled in a new program and changed his whole life. And he only told Sam Arbesman like years after the fact. It was like, hey, you changed my whole life. So I don't know. I guess what journals have going for them is like very clear metrics, right? Like, so I don't know, something to think about.
Yeah, DBZ has a question.
Yeah, I'm uh curious. Well, I have two questions, a short one and maybe a longer one. The first short one is if you really have clear evidence that people are sort of ripping off Asimov Press work, have you considered contacting the journals? Because I know people who have done that and been successful with it. And the journals have been like, oh my gosh, yeah, and force people to cite them essentially. And then the second question is, it seems to me like one of the major Dan Elton might have opinions on this, but it seems to me like one of the major value adds of a journal is peer review. Maybe the only value add of a journal is peer review. And so, how do you see that? One, do you think peer review is valuable? And two, how do you see things like Asimov Press managing to recreate that value?
Right. So for the first question, I don't know if people are actually ripping us off. It's more like we'll publish an essay. It does really, really well. Like, for example, one of our most popular essays ever, you know, another discussion we could have in the future is if anyone's curious, is like what articles do well. And unfortunately, it's usually the articles that you're not the proudest of. Like when people come up to me and they mention something I've written, they always mention stuff that I'm like, I wrote that crap in like an hour. Like I'm almost embarrassed you're citing that as like the work that inspired you. But one of our most popular articles, like millions of reads, is called Mitochondria Are Alive. It's kind of just like laying out the case that mitochondria should be classed as like their own organism. They don't only do energy generation, they also like, coax cells to kill themselves when infected. And so mitochondria have all these other roles in a cell. And then it just became very vogue, and I just started seeing a lot of things popping up like that. But it's like, it's hard to tell the chicken from the egg. It's like, obviously, the author who wrote that for us was citing research, like it was already a research field. It's not like we plucked it out of thin air. So I don't know, like, what is actually inspiring what. And I always feel good if our articles lead to just more attention on an issue that we think is important. And so I've never really cared about that per se, to like get credit for something. Um, and then for your second question, peer review, I think is for sure valuable. Uh, you know, as papers start getting churned out faster and faster, it must collapse at some point, or it must be automated in some way. I don't know what's going to happen. But we basically already recapitulate peer review, maybe not as a formal structure, but everything we publish is usually sent and read by at least two experts, and sometimes by like 4 or 5 experts. Like we published a piece on the sunlight budget of Earth. And it was just kind of calculating like, where does all the sunlight go that strikes Earth? What is it used for? Only a tiny portion is actually used to grow biomass, which was interesting. And we sent that to like 3 people and also published all of their comments because they had such differing opinions on the calculations and whatnot. And for me, that article was actually better than most journal articles that I could have found on that issue, because we just don't care. Like we have no structure. So if you're honest and you want to get things right, like it, in my opinion, it will be just as good as the journal article. And I also have some friends who are writers who pay people bounties to catch mistakes. For example, they'll pay you $50 if you catch an error in their writing. So I think you can just try these more interesting models of improving the work, like by not being beholden to some kind of dogmatic or historical structure. I don't know if that answered your question.
And this is also the thing where it's like you want some level of freedom and independence from other institutions or people, because sometimes it's like, oh, like this is sometimes you wouldn't write certain things if it might tick somebody off in a certain way, and people can get very protective of their theories and their ideas, which is very understandable. It's I'd say it's probably human nature, but like there is this sort of thing about, can you strike the right level of freedom, curiosity, and rigor? And I think there's definitely plenty of outlets that have combinations of those, but how many have like the perfect combination? And that's why I feel like at least what you've done with Asimov so far is, in my perception, you've sort of gotten a good sweet spot as far as I can tell right now. And that's why I was just very curious about the way everything was structured internally. As someone that is thinking about launching some kind of journal or something in the future, right? And I think there's even other people here that are kind of interested in that as well.
Yeah, two things on that. One is it's nice to be judge, jury, and executioner. A lot of people say, for example, that the editors at Nature have way too much power because they're basically deciding what is and what is not worthy of like this momentous, like it's a big deal to publish in Nature, and the editors basically decide who does and does not. One nice thing about running a publishing company is that it's just my taste, essentially. Like, we publish a lot of stuff that just does not perform well. It's niche and esoteric, and like I just don't care. Like I'm not beholden to any number of views. I don't need to get a certain number of anything because we don't really have any benchmarks we're aiming for. Our funders just fund us because they like our stuff. It's more like personal funding. And that also means, in some cases, we've had cases where reviewers say, I don't get this. For example, we just published a piece called The Price of E. coli. And the whole piece was basically, if you grow a liter of cells of E. coli, and you could theoretically isolate all the components. So you could separate out all the lipids, all the proteins, all all the different components, how much would it be worth? And the author just did this insane amount of work where he went to all the chemical supplier websites and he pieced out how much it costs to buy phospholipase A and purified ribosomes, and it was like $600,000 for a liter of cells. But obviously, it's not a real business proposal because isolation, purification, et cetera, is just like it's so much more expensive. Like it's not a real business thing. But we sent this to readers, and the piece was just completely criticized by all the readers. They all said, I don't get it. Like, what's the point of this? You're just like, why even ascribe a value to something that doesn't make any sense? And I published it anyway because I was like, I like the piece. It's a fun theoretical thing, and I don't care, and that's like the nice thing. And I know, so what I'm trying to say to wrap it up is like, I know people complain about journals and the power of editors, but it's also weird at the same time that we often idolize journals of the past that seemed edgier and had more personality. And that's strange to me because it almost seems like in the past, editors had even more sway. Like peer review is not that old. It used to be editors would fill their own pages and write for their own journals because they couldn't get enough submissions. And we idolized that time and we're like, that was a great time because journals were sort of a reflection of people's tastes. Yeah, exactly.
So I'm curious, do you think the whole system would be better if there were maybe many journals on super specific topics with very, very small teams where they were just sort of many very opinionated people?
I think so. I think even when very opinionated, sometimes opinionated people drive me crazy. And some, people tell me I should share my opinions more because opinions sell. And articles written with strong voices and strong opinions tend to perform better. And so, yeah, I mean, for sure, it just feels like there needs to be a way to explore a higher amount of surface area of ideas that unfortunately I find is often lacking from journals, and that's why blogs seem so ascendant. But at the same time, blogs just don't have the same. There's kind of a weird disconnect where like blogs reach a lot of students, it seems, and they get a lot of attention, but they don't often lead to like funding or things in the way journals do, even though they're often read by like orders of magnitude more people. So I don't fully understand that. Like, how do we address that problem? And maybe it is by merging the systems in some way, like having very opinionated journals that sort of have the academic cachet. I don't know. Yeah.
I wanted to say one quick thing before I let everybody else go, because I know we got some hands raised here. Is my current perspective, who some people here already kind of know about some of the things I'm thinking about, is I actually think the way these things are formatted will be very interesting for scientific lineage. Right? Like, how many of us wish we could have sat in on a conversation between Gödel and Einstein, or something like that, or Feynman and his students and stuff like that? Like, I think there's so many things in the history of science and technology that, because of the lack of technology at the time or whatever, is that we don't know, like, the sort of the cultural soup, the cultural computer that incubated some of these ideas. Because these things are not created in a vacuum, right? Like, sometimes I think we think, okay, this person's name is on this paper or this article, and they came up with the entire thing from scratch from out of nowhere. But it usually existed in some kind of feedback loop with the environment that they found themselves embedded in, right? Through conversations exactly like the ones that we're having right now. And so my philosophy on this is, I think you have your vessel for publications, which could be a journal or something like Asimov Press, and then you have, like, what I'm sort of trying to do with these kinds of salons in person and online, where you're getting sort of the everyone sort of thinking out loud. Like, this is a thing where we can, I have a friend who joins these salons sometimes, and he says it's like intellectual playtime. It's your time to think and ideate, take some risks on some ideas out loud that you may not necessarily end up actually building, but it's very much a part of the process about coming to a solution in something. And when you have a paper, even a really well written paper, you don't get like all the details and the flows of everything. It's sort of compressed for the point of publication. And so it's interesting to see the way these different formats have evolved, where now we can be thousands of miles separated from each other, and we could be talking about this right now and then put it up online for the world to see in 10 years. Like, let's just say out of this conversation, some really crazy stuff happens, right? We have a professor here working on stuff on language and cognition. Alon, if you want to talk about that later, we have all sorts of cool people. And when you put out the publication, you don't necessarily get the entire density of the history. You're just getting those things that you're trying to compress for that format. And so it'd be interesting to see if there's a sort of a harmonious relationship between open discussion in salons like this and even like the things that Michael Levin does on his channel these days, and then articles and journal releases. So I'm wondering if, Niko, my question to you is, seeing how these have almost sort of co-evolved with each other, what do you think is kind of the next step? Do these things just merge and maybe articles have a new format with AI where we can have a lineage very much put into the paper where you can track everything, like DBZ is sort of working on a tool that could be interesting for scientific lineage, right? About tracking where ideas come from and how they connect, because you don't usually get that in the paper. Only a handful of certain things that you're able to reference and connect.
Yeah, one of the reasons I'm so interested in histories, even though they're not very popular when we publish them, is because you kind of, you get to go into this sort of the origins of an interesting idea. And often there's so many surprises about where these things came from and the contingencies that made something successful or not successful. Like that's certainly the case with micropipettes, for example. Like the design that caught on um, had to do with thumbs and the ease of pushing down buttons with your thumbs, even though there were other designs in use. But I guess what I want to say is like, I meet people all the time who are very interesting, and I talk to them at conferences, and they say something that is just like, sometimes somebody says something that is almost like a punchline, and you're like, oh my God, have you written that down? Like that would be an amazing essay. And if you're a writer and an editor, you're always kind of hearing ideas where you're like, oh my God, that would be an amazing essay. And almost always these very interesting people are like, oh no, I just don't have time. And if you actually try to pull the essay out of them, they have kind of what I would describe as nebulous thoughts. Like everybody kind of has nebulous thoughts that could be piecemealed out into essays. And it's, humans don't want to read the piecemeal thoughts. They want to read the polished essay, and we kind of revere that and we say, oh, that's the highest form of thinking. And it has to have a nut graph and it has to have a compelling lead and thesis and hook. At the same time, the internet, we can store whatever we want online. And so it is weird that we only put essays online, really, or we try to make things human readable. That's probably limiting. And I'm sure other people here are thinking about ways to address this, like, just thinking about like the future and being machine readable and stuff like that. I know like Astera Institute is interested in recording conversations or maybe putting panels together, asking questions, soliciting responses to questions or bottlenecks in biology, and having some kind of recorder that is piecing things out into sort of recorded notes. I don't know. I saw someone raising their hand. Yeah.
I'm raised physically. So yeah, I think one very interesting way of thinking about this entire conversation is in terms of sort of the democratization of the process of publication itself. And it's we've seen exact parallels in other domains, obviously, the rise of social media and the extraordinary, the density of noise as opposed to signal in that case is in some ways a warning sign, like, okay, this is bad. If everybody's sharing their scientific results, oh, there's going to be a lot of crap. And what are we going to do about all the crap? We need gatekeepers. But the alternative, one way to think about this is if we're skating to where the puck is going, I know how I do my lit reviews now, and I suspect others do as well. We're already heavily using artificial intelligence as a means of information gathering, synthesizing, and the question then in my mind is whether we should just go for maximal sharing. And in the sense that why not put all your data out, like the file drawer effect? Why is there a file drawer effect? Because you can't get your negative results published. Why can't you get them published? Because nobody has time to publish those, because you have to go through this very painstaking peer review process, and we just don't have the bandwidth to publish all the negative results. Well, now we have a solution, right? Just put your data out there. Forget about, in someone's telling your story, right? The sort of a lot of the prose that goes into a human readable editorial process is perhaps becoming, I'm not going to say obsolete, but much less important. And this would make, potentially for the argument of just put it out there, and tell us what your data is. Tell us, I guess, some contextualize to some extent why you're putting it out there, but maybe we should be thinking more in terms of let the aggregators, let the AI, and I know I'm playing devil's advocate to some extent here, but let the AI ultimately adjudicate what your data means, whether it has value to the questions that any given researcher is trying to find out the answer to. I would love to know about all of those negative results. Of course I would. We all would. And it's simply inaccessible because the publication process was too strict a bottleneck. Why not aim for full maximal just sharing? And something, we have the archive model. I guess we have the blog model. There is no true editorial process at all. Is that not in some ways maybe the future that we should be heading for? Is give information in some way, or information processing is getting cheaper and cheaper. The human level or quasi-human level information processing is getting cheaper and cheaper. Why not pretend there's no bottlenecks anymore? And so I'm putting that sort of as a maximalist position, just for discussion. I'm not taking that position, but I'm certainly sympathetic to it. I think it's an interesting perspective to think that there's the reason why you needed editors, and the reason you needed even peer review back in the day to begin with was because it was physical publication, right? That was expensive as hell. You couldn't, who decides what those printing presses and all of the binding process and the dissemination, all of that was just incredibly expensive from a human resources and resources perspective. So the bottleneck was just absolutely necessary. You had to decide, and you had to be very, very restrictive in that decision process. But we are heading, certainly we're in the digital age, we no longer have that constraint. Publication just means post, right? It's just a click, a little electricity, and you're done. And then there's the only other piece is, of course, the signal to noise problem, right? So publication is almost free. Then there's the question of, well, who's going to read it, and how do you know it's read? And then that's where the AI piece, I think, is a very important part of the conversation. If that is, how is information going to be synthesized? Do we need, that strict editorial process so that you, as a human being who wants to know what the hell is going on in the scientific world, do you need an editor or a reviewer from Nature to say, yeah, this is important? If in fact somebody can find that result and say, here, this is relevant. Somebody said they did this. Unless we think they're lying, these are the results. You should know about them. And so, do you need sort of that middle process at all that determines what ultimately makes it into your brain? So that's sort of that's my big kind of sprawling thoughts on this.
Well, I agree with you. What I guess two comments that came to mind. One is I feel like we just need someone to try it. Like if an ARC Institute tried it and showed that they were getting good results in terms of progress on experiments or whatever, right? There's lots of ways to benchmark whether or not something like that's working. Put microphones into labs and record conversations and auto transcribe them. I'm waiting for people to do that. But yeah, I totally agree with you. And then the point of editors, I see myself as an editor. This is not true of all editors probably, but I think and I'm not saying I'm a good editor. So what I would say is a good editor is someone who has taste. So like a good editor is a good filterer, but you don't need editors to do everything, of course. And like a lot of news articles these days are so formulaic that you probably don't need an editor at all, right? But in terms of like the taste of the entire brand, or the taste of an entire journal, or the taste of an entire research group, is usually set by the professor, the editor, and so on. And so a good editor with good taste can drive progress in things that sort of this unfiltered search problem that you're referring to might not drive progress in the same way, right? So like if you want the field to pull in a certain direction, it helps to have a journal with taste or an editor with taste.
Yeah, this is
You don't
exactly
need
this.
it for everything.
This
Exactly.
is the you know, the conversation around, you know, sort of the democratization of information in social media. It's like, do we want everybody's voice to be heard? And there's a strong argument to be made that we really, really don't. And I think that but on the flip side, that's because the readers in that case are often themselves, you know, I don't want to sound elitist, but maybe easily swayed by things that we don't want them to be swayed by. Whereas if we're thinking about scientific research, um, you know, maybe we have to have faith in the readers, that they're going to be able to process information appropriately, so that we don't need them to be. Somebody else's taste shouldn't matter, right? Like, let them decide what the direction of science should be, or their own research, or in general. Let the zeitgeist be emergent, rather than dictated by an elite. You know, so these are, yeah, obviously, you know, sort of, these are big sort of social organization kind of questions. But we are definitely living in a time when we can ask them in a practical way. These are not academic questions. They're serious questions that scientists could go renegade, right, and say, I'm just going to start putting I'm not, like, as you mentioned, I don't forget the organization you mentioned. I thought that was fascinating. They do not allow their scientists to publish because they want to tear the damn thing down, probably because they'd be nodding along with this sentiment. And so, you know, if a large proportion of scientists suddenly said, screw that system, we're just going to start blogging, the whole thing could change tomorrow. And it really could happen. Although the whole prestige factor and all of that, right? It's the system. It's the currency by which, you know, academics earn their keep and things like that. All of that is structurally built in some level. But that's part of the problem too, right? It's like there's so much gamesmanship and all of this kind of stuff, and all of that. So yeah, it's just a ridiculously fascinating conversation. And you said that, you know, there are metrics. I'm curious, you know, if you wanted to do the experiment, so to speak, if you look at that, the output of that organization, for example, I guess they have ways of trying to measure impact, and impact is obviously something everybody could agree we'd want. If you're funding science, you want it to not die in the lab, right? You don't want your experiment to simply inform three people, which is, by the way, what often happens, you know, even in referee journals, because that's the only people who sometimes read certain articles. But you do want dissemination. You want impact. Are there ways, you know, what are those ways to measure impact beyond just a classic citation kind of criteria, which maybe don't always work, as your personal experience has borne out? How does one measure impact if that's the thing you're really after?
Well, I think it depends on the priorities of the founder of that organization. In the case of Astera, you know, they care about things like, do you report your null results in your failed experiments? That for them is a metric that is successful. It's like, we are public about failed experiments. But that's not a metric that like an academic tenure committee would care about.
Mhm.
You know, I think they also care about things like reads, you know, are scientists accessing the pages. The way that they publish things for context is, I think they made their own software where scientists just blog every day. Here's what I'm working on. Here's what I'm doing. And it updates at publication automatically. So they're kind of updating publications continuously all the time. There is no publication date
Hmm.
because
It's a live document. It's a living document.
yeah, and their idea is like, by forcing scientists to publish something, we force scientists to tell a story, even though there's usually so much more that has to be done, or so much more that has been done that is just not reported because it doesn't make sense in the story. And so they want to blow that up and kind of move to these living documents because they think it'll tell a fuller story. But yeah, you know, their metrics, I think, are just like, what scientists are reading this. They have public comments. People can leave comments and stuff. So it's much more of like a blog format. Like some of the metrics I would care about as a publisher, right, is like comments, engagement. I think they care about similar things. It's much more practical Salon sort of outcomes than, you know, publishing an article into the void and not knowing, much about it or how it's doing, right? Other than citations.
Right. I'm sure people have other questions, but just as a last thought on that note is maybe we'll need novel metrics that have to do with things like to what extent are your your experimental results showing up in people's uh, deep research, right? To what extent are these actually just showing up in? I mean, you thinking, back in the day, it'd be, PubMed, and then Google Scholar, and now the AI engines are all gathering information. Um, but that's a very different metric from citation. And again, those null results and all those things that it, they may not get cited much, but if somebody's saying, I really should try this experiment, and then they find out actually a lab has been trying this experiment for 5 years and it failed, that is incredibly valuable, right? I mean, that's the value there is far greater in some ways than a positive result could be, in many cases where you can just do incrementally. You've just saved a lab, all of those all that time, and gave them gave them their time to work on other stuff. So, are there novel ways to think about what impact means in an age of wide, broad dissemination, really the capacity for people to gather information in these non bottlenecked ways. I think that would be like a critical question or a critical problem to solve, because in the end, people have to get tenure. People have their careers, and yes, ultimately, I would love to say, and I think it's true, scientists primarily care about the science, and they really are doing their work because they care about it and they care about its impact. But in the end, that article in Nature, let's face it, it's the ribbon that you need to have. And if we don't have a way of credentialing stuff, and this is Addie and I were just talking earlier about this journal that we might want to start. If you can't put it on your CV and it doesn't help you get tenure, then that is a very significant ultimate limitation in whether that is something that people are actually going to pursue, right? We have to be very practical about these matters. So I think without ways of measuring and showing impact or something like that, then it doesn't matter if it's sort of in a platonically ideal that this is, let's just get all the information out there. That sounds really nice. But if people aren't getting credit for it in the way that they traditionally do, they're not going to do it. So yeah,
Well,
that
I mean, I just want to bring up something. I mean, like probably people are familiar with Goodhart's law. Like when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. And then if you have like, a culture that's not necessarily like driven by sort of like curiosity, like kind of like open-endedness, but more just like what's the next quarter of results? Like what's the next optimization? Like you need to prove that like you are doing something brilliant. Like Einstein wouldn't get funding in this environment to just like make Gedanken experiments in his head and then like create abstractions that like it's sort of like there's like a very big difference from trying to kind of have a culture where you try to prove something, but the only people you're trying to prove to are the ones in the existing institutions because you're trying to gain ethos in like it's like, oh, I'm one of you, like I can make something useful. But then it's like alternative independent systems, the ethos is like different. It's like a different thing. It's like, oh, like what open source thing have you created that is like useful that other people are using? Like there's the most low hanging fruit is to kind of quantify everything, but then you kind of like the things that you can't quantify that might be more complicated, and if you can't like fit it into like a resume, which is more like an advertisement for a person of like, oh, I can do this. There's kind of these like competing things where it's like, the reality is like that scientist has to get that funding. They can't just like put like, oh, here's a blog post that's not peer reviewed. Like obviously that blog post could be so much more helpful for like a lot of people and like a lot of scientists in the community, but then essentially there's like this auxiliary set of things where essentially like scientists and like people building things are like essentially compared to the modernization optimization slot machine game where it's like kind of like you need to produce content so then I can validate you with like here's the next marginal amount of funding, but then like all this does is it funnels all the funding into stuff that's already predictable, but the most valuable science was not predictable by any of these institutions. And so it's kind of like when you look at the bigger picture, where is most of the funding coming to scientists? And now, in the US, like obviously there's this kind of, starting to be this brain drain even of like scientists are not getting their funding, so they're just going to go to Europe or wherever, whoever's going to, because a lot of this stuff requires a society that understands the nuance and complexity of like some of these things, not like the value in ideas in and of themselves, and like an environment where it's like all of the thing like most of the journals they're very predatory, like the author doesn't get most of the royalties of anything that they want to be able to have you read their stuff, but it's like you can't even access them because there's this old world of like prestige and rigor, and then it's sort of like naturally mistrustful of like, oh, AI is going to do this and make it easier. I think a narrative that kind of gets kind of like overlooked, or rather kind of just taken as like normal today, is like we have in the in the computational sciences, the data sciences, frictionless reproducibility. That's allowing people to kind of reproduce things on other machines that like 30 years ago, like maybe you can read a paper, you can like read some ideas, but you're not like running the experiment on your own machine and kind of replicating results. We're in a kind of entirely different environment where those same incentives of like, okay, well, this is a big institution, we have cycles of budgeting that we need to do, we need to predict what happens, but then the reality of it is that like even like random undergrads might like produce like incredible science if they just are given like funding to do some side projects, but the only places they may be able to do that are in like like a startup community or some like random thing that's kind of unrelated to the immediate activities of whatever because kind of like all the systems are strained already, and they
Right.
kind of have to maintain themselves, so the metabolism of that kind of ecosystem, I feel like there's like a lot of new niches, but like it's still
But to play the sort of optimistic role with this, right? Like we have a number of people here like today. So actually there's a couple people from Frontier Tower, right? And they literally there's Morgan, right? They literally you guys have like what, a whole lab on one of the floors or something, like an actual wet lab? We can't hear you, by the way.
Yeah, yep. I'm in the lab right now. I
Yeah.
can give you a tour
Oh,
if you
nice.
want.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's so fascinating. That seems like a very SF thing, but I'm sure you could have it elsewhere, right? We have
We have
Dan Van
14 labs across the world in this network that are similarly functioning.
That's great. And this is like newer, right? This is like
Yeah,
within the
my
last.
goal is to get everybody within 6-hour drive of a lab space or less, because I
And then
think access to the tools of creating in biotech is probably one of our main limiting factors.
right. Right. And then we also have like Dan Van Zandt and Dugan Hammack, who are from the Wolfram Institute, and they've been running this thing for a little while. And there's the types of research that you see coming out of there, you probably would not see in more traditional formats, right? It's like it's giving space for people to think. I feel like interdisciplinary is a word that's maybe overused a lot, but I feel like they've sort of captured the spirit of it. And then we have Madhu, who runs this hacker house in New York called Homebrew, and it's a part of the residency, which I'm sure many of you have already heard of at this point. But Madhu, if you want to give a quick tidbit as to what your kind of focus is with Homebrew. Because these are the reason I'm doing this right now is to highlight that there are literally people that are trying their best to solve these kinds of problems, right? And there is sort of this weird decentralized effort where everyone's converging on a goal.
Yeah, it's funny because the direction just changed after this past weekend, where I just received a 1.2 mil grant to incubate research labs. So going in the right direction. But yeah, so Homebrew was always created to basically be a place for frontier researchers and people who challenge the way the world works. So it's been a blend so far of people who are kind of like hacker types who have real reverence for technology and work on things that don't necessarily have any sort of commercial interest in mind, because I do think that's how great things happen. And I also have experimented a little bit with alternative computing, so specifically neuromorphic computing. So these are areas that are kind of like pre-commercial research, or like still kind of like a pre-paradigmatic world that doesn't have a proper fitting in like the industry yet, and it's kind of just remained in academia for the most part. So this is why I'm like really big on research being done outside of academia. I think there's a place for like academia is useful, but I think it doesn't capture all types of researchers, and I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. But yeah, so this is kind of the space right now we have like 15, 16 people who live at Homebrew. We're in Lower Manhattan. But I am actually actively looking for a new place to start expanding the vision for Homebrew.
Yeah. We have a handful of questions, some people that have been waiting for quite a while. Jess, if you want to rock and roll.
Oh yeah. Hi. I'm Jesse. Can you hear me? I'm not showing. Okay, it is. All right. I'm Jesse. I'm with Joe Pro. We do a lot of interdisciplinary and research and the mentoring and scaffolding to support that in some ways. My question or comment, it's kind of been bridged upon, but my original comment was sort of about generational differences and realizing that I think what I've realized in kind of over the last few years in particular has been there's such a want for new ways of doing things. Like why residencies are so popular right now is just because I think people are very disinterested in some of the old models for clout. And I remember growing up, when I was in my first ever time in a neuroscience lab, my PI was like, "Oh, I've never heard of that journal. I never heard of that conference. We don't want to deal with that at all." And that was like it. It was like, look, if you're going to, if you're going to go that path at all, like you've got to do it. And I'm just really curious, like I think we're all here and hearing where we are now with this group of people, like we're really interested in there are people that are making this happen. So it's less maybe of a question or a comment, but more like I'm curious about sort of infrastructures that can support these efforts, like not just the micro labs, but the sort of the things between them to support them. Because I do think, like, to be very like curt about it, I think there's just an immense dissatisfaction with the prospects of having to go like the tenure track. And there's this social media is rife with all this stuff about, oh, I'm so glad I left academia and my mental health better after my PhD. I dropped out of my PhD and the blogs, but it's like, okay, we want more than blogs. We want more than rigor. We want more rigor than just, random stuff. But, how can we help coordinate those things? And I think maybe that's an open question for us to come back to later than one to answer right now. But I'm glad this group of people is here doing what we're doing.
Well, I just want to add a point to that, Jess. Like, I think like this kind of when you look at kind of like maker communities and like tinkering communities, like the kind of distributed platforms that like there's like right now like no unified kind of like way to kind of like have everyone's efforts in an organized way kind of like add onto each other. But there's like, separate groups that are kind of pushing the charge. Like I think it only takes like a couple people to really like focus kind of the community's attention that already believes like yes like we can make all of this infrastructure more accessible, but also like inform people about like here's how we can like create entire ecosystems of alternative ways of doing careers in general. And I think
Right.
that's just the nature of what we're going to see in the next 10 years really is with AI is going to do certain things, but humans are going to focus on things that even AI can't do. Like what questions should we even want to work on? I think like there's like so much low-hanging fruit of like people that have historically been kind of left out of this. And I think that kind of like ivory towery kind of thing, because a lot of it actually is obfuscated. Like it's not actually as complicated as it's kind of guarded to be, but it's actually like something that would benefit from, like, for instance, if the Python programming language was not invented, like so many people couldn't do data science that you don't have to learn like Java or like C++ to do that. Like I think a lot of this stuff is going to be more accessible, and kind of I think that the tooling for bringing more of the community together in more unified ways. And I think one way I think about kind of like these residency programs and stuff is like thinking of who, you know, during the Renaissance era, like there was like essentially residencies with like the greatest artists of the time. Like it would be like, oh, like the best person at this skill is now teaching other people about that. And I think you know, like originally PhDs and stuff like that were all about that kind of thing, and then it became something bigger because it had to concord with the logic of capitalism. And I think like there's a difference about the truth of knowledge and like what are you trying to really understand versus like, okay, prove that you are valuable. And I think that kind of attitude that kind of has to shift to make this possible. But I think there's a lot of people that understand that.
Yeah, Niko, your thoughts before we go to Dan's question.
Oh man, I'm not sure I have thoughts. The thing I was thinking about is I don't know, it's weird. Well, you know, I've thought about how like our funders at Asimov Press are billionaires, and a lot of billionaires are funding some of these weird Arc Institute and Astera Institute. But of course, there's so many smaller organizations of just very motivated people who go out and raise money, right? Like Dynamic Land. You know, I don't know if Brett Victor has any billionaire backers, but I don't have any concrete thoughts about how to grow the pie, so to speak, other than make highly motivated people believe that they can just go do things, right? Like when I was in journalism school, my professors, you know, like it was a big deal to get a staff writer job. Like the journalism market is so bad. My professors were like, wow, Niko, you got a staff job. That's like amazing. You know, in 10 years, you'll be an editor, you know? It's like, that's kind of it's kind of like academia. It's like very hard to become an editor, very difficult. Like you would never start a publication. And then I just started a Substack blog and I asked someone for money and they said yes. And my life changed, right? And you just go off and do things like, so I don't know. You know, but at the same time, there's a lot of discussion right now on agency. So I think what I'm saying is not new or surprising in any way. So
before you get to the next question.
Yeah, real quick before we go to Dan.
But you're touching on a definitely a critical question of sort of the public versus private funding of science. Dan and we've chatted about this a bit. If it's the billionaires who get to decide the direction of where science goes, or at least they delegate, right? If the billionaires are delegating, is that a good direction? Is that what we mean by a more open and democratic scientific process? I don't know. It's an alternative to the current model, but obviously it does come with some risks.
Yeah.
Dan.
Hey,
Alton.
yeah. Well, my question is kind of related to what Elon just said. You know, we are seeing a proliferation of private research institutes and private donors, kind of, and especially now with the science funding being cut. You know, all these private initiatives are taking on a new importance. And I actually didn't know that you worked at New Science. And so I guess you've sort of seen kind of at the ground level and inside like two of these organizations, I guess, New Science and Arc Institute. And I was just wondering kind of to get a sense from you, like, how is it going? Because it is kind of like a big experiment right now with all these different private initiatives. And my guess would be like there would just be very high variance. But you know, it just remains to be seen, you know, how it all works. And I was wondering if you could give some, you know, some perspective on how it's going.
How it's going. Well, feel free to guide me a little bit if I'm not answering. But, you know, when you said high variance, I'm assuming you mean high variance across organizations and what they do. And indeed, I would say in terms of the meta science orgs, the two orgs that are probably farthest apart is New Science and Arc Institute, because New Science was like a guy who raised like $3 million and was trying to figure it out, basically. And Arc Institute is like hundreds of millions of dollars with actual labs and an actual building. New Science, we worked out of a WeWork, and we were like trying to identify young geniuses and give them grants, um, and there wasn't really a clear thesis. And indeed, now I think New Science has pretty much collapsed. I think he's still distributing some funding, but it's basically over. And he joined OpenAI as on the staff, the guy who started New Science. Arc Institute seems to be going very well, but they've they haven't done a full sort of schism from academia in the same way that other billionaire-funded new research organizations are trying to be much more distinct from academia. ARC takes professors from Stanford and Berkeley and UCSF and gives them. Yeah, I'd be curious what you mean. Like ARC, like by what metric is ARC going well? And other comments here on Alexi.
Well, like, are they producing good science? in your opinion, I mean, you have a background in biology, or are they just sort of like mopping up all this money, And the other one is Astera Labs. You mentioned Astera is one of your funders.
Yeah.
They've had a number of scientific initiatives. I think they had some of them have actually shut down. So like they had one which I believe was called the Rejuvenome, which I think kind of petered out, is my sense. And they had some issues with intellectual, I think, agreements with universities and stuff, and it kind of petered out. They also had sort of like a neuromorphic or brain-inspired initiative, and I think that also has sort of collapsed. I on their website now they have something. It looks like it's been rebranded to, AGI, going after AGI safety. But yeah, kind of. Do you have any idea how things are going, like at Astera and just at ARC Institute? Because I don't have any visibility into it. I don't really know much about what's going on there, to be honest. I know they hired a lot of scientists, big name scientists.
Well, so I guess I'll just first talk about ARC. I know less about Astera, just for full context. I've never, I've spent like one day at Astera, and so I probably know as much as you do, even though they're one of our funders. ARC Institute, I did a writing residency there, so I spent a few months there, and I learned a lot about the organization and spent most of my time writing a document that is basically how the organization works. So I interviewed all the major players, Silvana Konerman and Patrick Sue, who run it, two co-founders. So I can just, I guess, like to talk kind of rapid fire, and I don't know if this is useful or not, but hundreds of millions of dollars. They have their own building. They are recruiting scientists from major universities. And then they kind of have split up what they're doing into two categories, which I would call the top down and the bottom up. So they have these things called core, what are they called? It's something like core facilities, but not in the academic sense of being service providers. These are like people who could run their own labs at major academic institutions. They're very, very good scientists, and they're going after the virtual cell thing, or they're going after another initiative called the Alzheimer's disease initiative, both of which really involve virtual cells. So they allocate a ton of money to this sort of moonshot of virtual cells, paying computational teams, machine learning teams, omics teams to collect data for that effort. And those teams work together to do the virtual cell stuff. And they're not motivated to publish. They don't really care if they publish. So it's kind of something that might not get done otherwise, right? It's like a top-down vision of the founders want this thing, and so I'm going to pay a cohort of people to go after that thing. At the same time, the other half of ARC is just like basic science research. Its labs are given unrestricted funds to do what they want. I think for core investigators, I'm not sure, but I think it's like $3 million a year. So that part of the model is kind of based on the MRC LMB, maybe, of like unrestricted funds. You don't have to apply for grants. And in that case, I would say the first people they hired were doing a lot of like genome editing technology development and high throughput technology development. Like we want better omics. Like it kind of felt like they were bringing in faculty who were doing research that could serve the virtual cell in some way. But now actually they're hiring faculty that don't seem to fit in that, at least in ways that I can't understand. Like, for example, they hired someone named Isha Jain, who was brilliant. Like my favorite investigator at ARC, to be blunt in terms of research. She studies oxygen sensing in the body. How does the body sense vitamins and oxygen? For decades, we thought that the only oxygen sensor in the body was hypoxia inducible factor, HIF. But we now know that there are dozens of oxygen sensors. And so she's doing very interesting stuff. And I'm like, this doesn't seem to make sense with the virtual cell. So it's kind of weird. They have the core faculty, and then they have this top-down moonshot sort of thing. And they're splitting their money between that. But the thesis when I met them, because of course I asked, like, why are you funding both of these? Why not just try to go after the virtual cell? The thing they told me was that the core faculty will make discoveries that keep us ahead of the curve in serendipitous ways, sort of thing. Like if we only funded the virtual cell, we would fall behind in 5 to 10 years. Whereas if we do that and have faculty, we can keep developing IP and stuff that helps us in the next thing so that the org won't become stagnant. Now, what I would say is like, is the money going to waste? What I would say is a lot of the faculty they've hired would have no trouble getting funding elsewhere. Some of them are like HHMI type faculty, and they go to ARC because they think that's the right environment to do this sort of stuff that they want to do. So I don't know. At the same time, I feel like the virtual cell stuff requires such a huge timeline. It's like a decade's timeline that it wouldn't be possible without some sort of huge, no strings attached sort of investment. So that side I get. So yeah.
So I never even heard of this virtual cell thing. Is that sort of like a focused research organization type effort, would you say? Or and does it involve a lot of like AI, or is it more like network based modeling, or is there also like a lab component to like discover new pathways and interactions?
Yeah, so the virtual cell effort is a lot of AI and a lot of experimental data collection. Essentially what they're doing is you take individual cells, human cells of different types, and you profile their RNA expression. So you know which RNA molecules are being expressed in these different human cells. And then you perturb those cells and you measure how their RNA profiles have shifted. So they are basically building, their first model is basically a virtual perturb-seq. So it's an AI model that predicts how a cell's transcriptome will be perturbed without having to do the experiment. And the reason they argue that this is important, and I'm not going to like cast my own opinions on this, is because a lot of diseases are diseases of perturbation where something in the cell is perturbed. And we would like to be able to predict what a perturbation does in terms of the cell's state, and also how to revert that state back to a healthy state. And so they're building essentially a virtual perturb transcriptome prediction engine. But of course, there are, the word virtual cell is used in many, many different ways. That's the ARC virtual cell. The Chan Zuckerberg Biohub has their own virtual cell. Other people are building much more multi-omic virtual cells that incorporate not just RNA levels, but also proteomics and other metrics. So we'll see who wins and which ends up being most useful.
That's very cool. Yeah, I just wanted to mention also, just as a side note, we had Ekkolapto and Addy hosted an event with Parm from Peripheries Genetics, and I wasn't able to go to it, but I talked to her while she was in Boston, and they're actually kind of working on something similar, or they have ambitions to go to something similar. Right now, they're using like non-invasive spectroscopy and photonics to measure the state of cells, but then longer term they want to use AI to kind of like predict how cells are going to respond. So it's kind of interesting. I imagine there's a lot of people that are kind of going after that virtual cell idea, but like the ARC Institute could have a major edge just because of the scale. I mean, most labs are kind of small, right? So
yeah, that's a big thing, is you need huge data collection efforts. And in this context, they've hired a lot of truly the best people at single cell transcriptomics. Like they hired the guy who invented Perturb-seq and lots of droplet microfluidic methods to isolate individual cells. And he just works on this virtual cell initiative. Like he could have been a professor probably, but he decided to work on this instead. And then of course there's a drug company, right, that's ostensibly doing virtual cells, Zera Therapeutics, and then there's also Noetic. Yeah. So there's a lot of people making bets in different ways on what's going to happen. Yeah. Usually for drug discovery.
Do you believe there's robust enough data coming from what currently exists in transcriptomics, or do they have to generate new data sets?
They're collecting a lot of new data sets. And then they're also they're doing interesting things, like they have something called SC Agent. ARC Institute worked on this, and it's basically find all transcriptomics data sets released online and like clean up and structure their metadata so that we can actually use them. So they're doing different things. I think the type of data that is hard to collect in this context is like really good single cell transcriptomics data. Like there's just not a lot of individual cells that have been measured for the perturbation stuff specifically.
Whatever happened to companies like, do you guys remember the beacon system from Berkeley Lights? It was like $1 million system, but I was like so into it, like 10,000 experiments, these nano wells, single cell, you're able to measure everything with optofluidics. It was awesome. Whatever, like, how come those kind of things aren't as successful nowadays? Like, you would expect the cost curve to come down.
Yeah, I don't know. I remember meeting one of the guys from Berkeley Lights and learning about it for the first time, and I was like, this is science fiction. But then, I don't know. I haven't heard anything about him. Yeah, to be honest with you, like, a lot of bloggers in biotech write about companies. I've just never understood like companies and business models. I've just never been like super interested in it. Like I just mostly read papers. I'm kind of like a boring academic style writer. So histories of science, very traditional.
Anybody else has any other questions? I have a couple myself. I want to go back to or actually real quick, James from the Wolfram Institute, if you have any thoughts or questions.
Yeah, I just joined a little bit late, but fascinating topics of discussion here. I think we need to have more of these kinds of open conversations about this space. It feels like in the last 5 years, with some of these smaller research institutes that you mentioned, that there seems to be quite a few popping up. There's a good collection of these on the Overedge blog, if you're familiar, that's kind of like listing out this space. But somebody mentioned cohesion the other day, like how can we form an ecosystem? I think that's very interesting topic of discussion. We actually just got a research grant now to look at that, specifically leveraging the DSAR space or whatever. But yeah, I think like from our situation, and sorry, it's not a question, I'm just spitballing. We started the Wolfram Institute in earnest like 2 years ago, and we managed to get a few grants from philanthropic foundations, some federal funding, and philanthropists. But we were very, very lucky because we have Stephen Wolfram as this person that kind of like knows everyone in the space and is like a good, reputable name to start our institute. But if we didn't have that, I don't know how we would be able to do anything, regardless of like how good our researchers might have been and like try to work on it for free. We thought maybe we could get money from the community. You know, we have like millions of people that watch Stephen's work on YouTube, but how do you tap that to get funding to pay for researchers? It feels almost impossible. So my question is kind of like, yeah, do you have any comments on that kind of like, I don't know, a bit of chicken and egg thing? It's like, unless you have good research, you can't get funding, but how do you get people to trust you to pay for the researchers? It's like a kind of a tough space.
Does anyone else have thoughts on that?
I actually have a thought on it from some of the work I'm doing with the Wolfram Institute, which is funny that James brings it up. So this is unpublished, James. So this might be James' first time hearing about it, but I'm doing work on sort of like history of science and what the pathway is for research and development, and at what points research and development on an important technology was severely underfunded and what the causes were. And what James is saying is like something I found is I call it the preliminary data paradox. So we've lost many, 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 many years of important research and development and technology that we could have had much earlier to the preliminary data paradox, where you have to have some sort of data or findings to get funding. You have to have fundings to get the data. And nobody's willing to be that first person. And a lot of times that first data is actually relatively cheap. So one of the things that I think is that a lot of grants are very large, sort of in like the hundreds of thousands of dollars range or higher. And I think micro grants are really amazing, and we need more of those. We need more grants that are like $10,000 or less, where it's like, I have no idea if the work you're going to do is good, but it's $10,000, so who cares? Or $5,000 or $800. I'm going to give you the money and see what comes of it, and then maybe that can get the data that can get larger grants, things like that.
It's difficult in biology though. And I mean, if you take the counterexample, like what the ARC Institute is doing, like $100 million, okay, fine, you need wet labs and all that kind of stuff. But I wonder if there's like a diminishing return curve where like anything more than, you know, a certain amount, more money you throw at it is kind of like on a diminishing scale. And I don't mean to pick on ARC specifically. I mean, there's a few in Silicon Valley that kind of like have taken that approach.
Well, it's sort of like a bad strategy or like a bad idea with more money, or sort of like there's going to be a saturated basin where it's sort of like you're not going to be able to get a diverse enough, solution, because you're essentially just like doubling down on something that if you see results, then like you can go to a certain point. But I think it would be interesting to see like, if you could like run an experiment where you have like a simulated planet and you have like a simulated civilization, and you give one civilization kind of like, everyone kind of gets like the grant process is like really easy to get, like really small grants, like iteratively based on progress. And then there's one where it's like there's like a really long convoluted process, and like it kind of gets concentrated in a couple of groups' hands. I think like while a couple of hubs where there's like really really a lot of capital is put to a couple of bets, seems like a good strategy, like in the scale of like a civilization where you have like possibly millions of people as part of that ecosystem. Like I think like we don't have a good grasp or like intuition as humans on like what would actually be what interesting, valuable ideas would other people that don't have our context have to solve kind of our problem in like unique ways. And so like maybe like that the funding for a lot of exploration is just like out of reach of most people, and it's kind of requires you to essentially be an expert grant writer, means that a lot of people that would have created great solutions are just not good grant writers. Then the people who are good grant writers get the funding. I think you would see that where you give people more money iteratively, you would see a lot more progress on the science in general.
I'm
I
curious,
can also,
question for
yeah.
Niko. Just looking at Asimov Press website, like how much money are you bringing in outside of the support you're getting from Stripe and Asteria, like in terms of the merch store and that kind of thing? Like, is is it significant, or it's just for fun?
Nobody buys merch. We sell books. I mean, our books are, outside of just philanthropy, our books are where the only place really we make any money. I mean, just to give a very transparent cost breakdown, this year, so in our first year, Asimov covered everything. So they were paying our salaries and also all of our editorial budget, paying writers, paying artists. We commission artists to make all the original artwork for each.
Yeah, you got great taste in the artistic direction, by the way. I want to make a comment on that. I'm a big fan.
This year, Asimov is covering our salaries, so they're still our biggest. That's the biggest cost we have, is just salaries. And then Stripe and Astera together are 250K, which actually was enough to print 2,000 DNA books. So we printed 2,000 of these. And then the 250K also covers all of our travel, writers, artists, fact checkers, copy editors, website. I mean, it goes a long way. And we sold the books, and basically we make our money back. So like to print 2,000 copies, when you factor in the book designers and you factor in everything like that, it costs like $50,000 to make a book. And then we sell them, we might make our money back, or we might make like a couple $1,000s. And then if we make a profit, we donate it actually to charity. So we don't make any money on our books. We don't run any ads, and we don't sell any subscriptions. So we're, so if our funders ever backed out, we'd go out of business basically the next month. We're a terrible investment. But I'm also okay with that, because I'm like, if Asimov Press ever died, I'd be like, all right, and I'd go on to the next thing. I don't have like deep emotional attachments to it.
Is it a registered nonprofit?
No, we're not.
No, okay. I see.
Two,
Like a social company, yeah, social good.
Yeah, technically we are part of Asimov, the company. So technically we're like a Delaware C Corp, because we are a department within Asimov. It's just I never go to Asimov team meetings. I don't even know what they're doing anymore. And still, despite that, we were able to raise money, which I think is good. Astera, a nonprofit giving money is maybe not as weird as like Stripe giving money. I don't know. So yeah, we're basically beholden to our funders in terms of longevity.
I get,
Oh.
yeah. What I was going to comment on was a couple of different things. I think one of the first ones is that biotechnology on the whole has a marketing problem. And so when you ask somebody what they think about a laboratory scientist, normally the conclusion they jump to is something escaping from the lab. And that's overall bad for virtually everybody here who is working in sciences in general. And instead of like science being something in which we celebrate, it's something that we fear. And I think it partially relates to how we communicate about science. So I actually really appreciate everything you're doing, Niko, to popularize, celebrate, put on the stage and market a lot of the really cool stories in sciences. And we need more of that. I tend to ask people, what is the number one marketing for the US military? And it's kind of surprising. It's actually the movie Top Gun. And it's because when people went to the movie theaters and saw like all these jet pilots flying around, they were like, wow, I really want to do that. That's amazing. That's aspirational. And if you ask somebody at Ginkgo, like, what is their inspiration? They say Jurassic Park. I think that's a shit inspiration, because what happens in Jurassic Park, the dinosaurs escape and kill everybody. So like, if that's the narrative in scientific storytelling, it's kind of terrible for all of us, right? Like the assumption is that something's going to escape the lab and kill everybody. And when you look at the number of people that are actually involved in the sciences, and you read something like Owl Posting put something up recently where they ended up talking about how at a certain point you're going to be catheterized and everybody's going to die and you're going to be on the bad side of medicine and it's going to be really terrible. And the fact that more people aren't working in biology is really, really kind of sad. Jake Wintermute asked the question, how many people have actually conducted a novel CRISPR experiment? And I think it's somewhere on the order of less than, 20,000 people. Whereas you look at a developer community in software and it's like over 1 million people. So like how many people will we have actually contributing to creation of new scientific knowledge in biology is pretty minimal. And we've artificially restricted that by making it so that you have to get a PhD in order to have the credential to then say, hey, you know what you're doing. And it's partially because of laboratory access. And so that's part of the point of opening up laboratory access to more people and spreading these open access, low cost community labs all over the place. But as a lead into that, something that I believe Daniel ended up saying is microgrants. So we're kicking off a microgrant program in conjunction with Valley DAO to give out like $5,000 microgrants to people who are participating in these community laboratories. So something that like experiment.com did really, really well as well is just like crowdfunding for science, doing different things where as a community, we have a grassroots methodology to start priming the pump on new ideas. And these edge cases where you wouldn't normally see ideas come to the front. We kind of have this confirmation bias in the sciences because whoever is trained is the one that is actually dictating what experiments get run, as opposed to pie in the sky ideas. I love this little story. I was teaching a 7-year-old in the laboratory and he asked why plants aren't black. And I was like, what? Like, that's an excellent question, though, when you think about it. And we were talking about light absorption and color. And he was like, why aren't plants black? And like those kind of questions you only really get when you expose these techniques in science and biology to people who've never encountered it before. And so the microgrant is just kind of one example of that. The main cost of doing science is really like, in essence, when you're getting started, is access to laboratory space and living space. So we're also setting up a residency program here in San Francisco, which I'm excited to kind of launch and talk more publicly about too. But yeah, open up the discussion for other people.
James and Alon, we've got James, if you want to go real quick.
Sorry,
Please.
Elon, you go first.
Oh, no, it's fine. Please. It's a very half-baked idea. Maybe it'll bake a little more while you're.
I just wanted to riff off what you're saying about the funding going towards biology, because if you compare it to software engineering, I guess I'd just like to see what the actual metrics are, because from just what I've seen, like biology is probably an order of magnitude more funding compared to any other science in terms of like actual research that happens. Compare that to physics or economics or anything else, it's just like and it's also just like, because of, if you want to make progress in biology, it's a lot of the time it's wet labs, and like a wet lab is like how many millions of dollars just to get started, whereas in physics you just need a pen and paper or whatever. But yeah, I'd love to actually see that proper breakdown there, because even software engineering is not maybe necessarily research per se, so it's difficult to compare those. Just, yeah, I wanted to see what if you had a response on that.
Me, you mean?
Yeah, whoever could have something to say.
Yeah, like I'm kind of shocked at how small the NSF is, considering it funds basically everything else, compared to like the NIH, which I guess ostensibly is focused on health. At the same time, like Elliot, you mentioned you're surprised more people don't work on biology because we're all going to get catheterized. And, my motivation to work in biology is unfortunately the things that were kind of poo-pooed in that article. Like, I love to see videos of ribosomes and stuff moving. I don't know why, but so I don't know. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a difficult question. Don't know if I have a good answer. Physics, it seems like a lot of funding goes to fit like huge efforts, right? Like Hubble or like LIGO. Whereas in biology, there are so many labs, and there really are so many people who graduate with bioscience PhDs. I thought it was like 20,000 a year now or something in the US. I can't recall. I don't know. Like at the same time, I wish less people were working on medicine, actually, which might be a not a popular opinion, but like I encounter interesting biology ideas all the time that just do not get funding, that seem to me like they could have very weird serendipitous effects on lots of important things. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm just rambling at this point.
I think it's also important to mention that this group that we have here today is sort of already a self-selection for systems kind of thinking, as people say these days. Systems generalists, whatever label or name you want to touch on to it. I think there's people that are more thinking about, you know, the parts of the way everything connects together, but also like the greater, if you were to zoom out and look at everything and then connect the dots, right? We're a lot of us here today are not necessarily specifically focused on one distinct area and that's it, right? It's sort of a broader approach to things. And I think that alone is also kind of responsible for the slight change in tune that we're seeing these days. I wanted to talk about OSV quite a bit. So we had Utman, who handles a lot of the fellowships and grants over there on. Earlier, we had Harry Gandhi, who was an advisor in residence at 1517 Fund. And both those organizations are very much dedicated to this kind of renegade science kind of thing, you know, if you had to put it in words. And like O'Shaughnessy Ventures, for instance, like I was fortunate enough to be able to go to the retreat, their offsite that they had earlier this year in Connecticut. Very, very valuable time. Literally one of the best memories of my life, honestly. And there was an in-person podcast that Jim was doing with a couple people there about sort of thinking in terms of fiction to get access to different kinds of ideas. So I want to riff on the science fiction thing for a second about Jurassic Park and everything, where it's like, there is also like I think someone from OSU is working on this book called White Mirror, which is basically about, well, let's not have dystopia. What does a utopia actually look like? Right? If you looked at it from like an engineering perspective, how would you actually create this thing like that? And maybe there's these things are all double-edged swords at the end of the day in one way or another. But the fictional thinking thing is interesting because now, like, I'll give a very specific story from my life personally. So after I hadn't seen I don't know, it was Ben 10 the cartoon. And I know multiple people that have been inspired by Ben 10 to get into biology, by the way. It was a cartoon on Cartoon Network in the 2000s, right? One of my favorites, especially the original classic show. And then stuff like Spider-Man and everything. And, you know, now after having taken a slight break from that for a while and coming back to it, and I'll watch it again, and I'll be like, you know what? You know, maybe this is really just an engineering problem. Maybe this isn't really science fiction. And I think what science fiction does, what fictional thinking does, like when I think it was Elliot was giving the example about somebody asking about, oh, why isn't the plant black or something? It's like giving yourself permission to think in these terms, right? And I think when you're and this also ties into the generalist kind of approach to things, where it's like when you undergo a certain amount of training, it's literally training in the most literal sense. You're training and tuning your brain to work and pick up and extract information in very certain ways. And yeah, that might be good for certain tasks, but also might have some drawbacks. And I think some of the drawbacks is you don't necessarily think of things like this. Or even if the thoughts do come up, you don't necessarily, you sort of tone it down. You don't even try to amplify it in the slightest. And I just think of like science fiction is also a really interesting way of looking at the direction that we take scientific projects, because there are people that are inspired by it and you know, small ways or large ways. And this is also, I will say that science fiction, whether they're in books, comics, movies, whatever it is, are actually very crucial aspects of scientific communication, because it's setting the point of inspiration, right? Like how many people have been inspired by science fiction stories? I mean, for me personally, I'm actually more interested. Some people already know about this. I love Star Wars and Star Trek, but Harry Potter and wizardry was more fascinating, because like, how the heck is that telekinesis? Is that telepathy? Could you actually engineer that? Like, then I think about things like Neuralink and BCIs, and like, what does a biological BCI look like, and all these kinds of things. And it's like, you don't normally get access to those ideas unless you're digesting that kinds of information to some degree. And so my point that I want to make with this is that science fiction is, I think, a very crucial aspect about scientific communication as a whole. And I think it would be very interesting if we had, I don't know if we need to necessarily mix the worlds together, right? I don't know if I wouldn't say mix them, but sort of connect them in that, let's establish, we're talking about scientific lineage and the origins of ideas and where all these innovations come from. Can we trace it from the patterns of mind that happen when you think of fictional stories, right? Because if you think about this, when you're starting off on a project or something definitely more ambitious, like it sort of exists in the space of fiction. You haven't made it real yet. And so I think there's my point with this is I think there's a lot we can learn from science fiction if we give ourselves permission to. And I would be very interested to see, something like an Asimov Press or a computational philosophy journal or whatever things look like, to sort of connect that with science fiction. Is we have one area that's dedicated to science fiction. Let's just think out loud about these ideas, right? And construct a kind of greater structure around it. And then there's one separate side, you flip the book over, and that's all about how you actually build the thing.
Yeah. Well, we've published some science fiction at Asimov Press, and some of those are my favorite pieces. Like we published a piece from Richard No about, it's called Tinker. It's about an AI designing its own chips to make its successor by engineering cells. So it's engineering cells to extrude carbon nanotubes that print chips, and then actually it became like an FRO proposal later. So that was pretty inspiring because we saw sort of a direct connection. Like we published this piece, and then Adam Marblestone tweeted it, and he was like, "There's actually a few good FRO ideas in here," and then that was inspiring. We don't publish a lot of sci-fi because we are so exceptionally dry in the type of sci-fi that we publish. Like I get more pitches for sci-fi than any other topic by far because there are so many fiction writers. We probably get like 30 fiction pitches a week. Also because we're listed in like Asimov's Monthly and like some of the sci-fi magazines that have pitch sections of like which magazines are commissioning. We're there for some reason. And so we get so many pitches, but the things people send us are more like dialogue heavy space opera stuff that just we don't publish. We're very like technology focused sci-fi without a lot of plot. Maybe there's a simple plot. Like it's much more about exploring what technologies might look like in the future. And it's, in my experience, very hard to source those ideas, let alone find someone who is like aware of the edge and able enough to weave that into a science fiction story in the way that like Quantum, I don't know if people here know Quantum, but like he's one of my favorites. You know, Ted Chiang, right?
I think like the Stanislaw Lem of like the
Yeah.
21st century is like they're making little like short stories somewhere on the internet, but they're probably like no one knows except like a couple people probably. And the people who were able to, because like not every artist or creator is like easy to find because maybe their niche is so specific and it's so insular. But I think there's people out there that are making really poignant and brilliant insights that like aren't even scientists. They're just like so imaginative. I think that is when I think about like interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, it's like the people who are essentially these like polymaths and able to express complicated ideas and explore a kind of imaginal worlds of like here's a possible world. And I think that is a very powerful kind of narrative framework to allow. And I think probably everyone who's working on all this stuff, like there's something they can point to that it's like that's their inspiration. Like for me, like Ian Banks' culture novels, like a lot of the classic sci-fi, like all that stuff, it's like, oh, could that exist in our world? It's like I think like there is less emphasis on that than there should be much more emphasis on a lot of that stuff, because some of the most kind of productive and brilliant scientists, they aren't necessarily talking about how these inspirations kind of shaped how their thinking works. And so kind of science fiction I see as like a one way to think of it is like a blueprint for new kinds of ways to perceive reality and think about alternatives to our existing reality. And so I mean, I think like that combined with kind of like the same people making the stuff, they should be upgrading their philosophical culture to kind of integrate kind of art in this creative approach. But I think that's like a ecosystem-wide process. I think like the kind of writers who are working on that stuff, I think there should be more like writing residencies and like, just spaces where you can go and, kind of think about this. Forums like, the one we're having right now, where it's like you can just kind of talk about this stuff, and it's like, you might come across something that changes your worldview. I think this is, I would say, like a golden age for something like this to be possible at a scale that previously was inaccessible. And I think, we're gonna see more and more of this if like we try to create a way to reinforce it. I have a question, I guess, like about what do you think is a way where kind of like when people are like thinking of their kind of what they're doing, what they're working on, like how to encourage more people to like make their own communities around these kinds of things, like
Wow. But what do you mean by community?
sort of like the process of working through these ideas, building these things up, like getting more people that wouldn't have ever thought about these ideas, like creatively to really engage with it more deeply. Like if they only see it as like an instrumental thing, like how to get them to see the other side and then be like, wait a minute, this is a very novel way to think about it. And like,
Wow. Well, the route I've always taken is just if you write things and you publish them on the internet, I believe people will find you. Even if the writing is bad, even if it's not well developed. Like, when I started writing, I wrote some blog. My first blog was just a collection of links to synthetic biology papers. It was called This Week in Synthetic Biology. That was my first blog. And I just put links into a newsletter with zero context and zero writing. It was literally a list of links to papers with no words. And I got like 3,000 subscribers in like a few weeks. Like synthetic biologists were like, oh, this guy is collecting synthetic biology papers. I added my recommendations later, actually, Elliot. I think that was like week 4 or week 5, but yeah. So it's like that to me is a sign that like you can basically do anything. And if people just put themselves out there and are overt with their asks, usually that's another thing. It's like when at Asimov Press we ask our readers for something, our response is overwhelming. But if you don't ask, you usually won't get a response. Like we recently put out, for example, we announced we're writing this book it's called The Making of the Modern Laboratory. We're going to publish this book that kind of tells the history of why the laboratory looks the way it looks, the molecular biology laboratory. And we said, if you want to help us write this book, send your pitch here with very clear instructions. And we've gotten like 500 emails so far. And it's been a huge pain just to go through the emails. Whereas if we just announce that we're doing this book, I might expect like 2 emails or 3 emails. So that's another thing, is like asking for help in public, being explicit about what you're creating in public. And a lot of people don't do that. Like they might say, oh, here's an interesting thing, but they never go the next step of saying, this is interesting to me and here's what I'm going to do about it. And if you're interested in that too, you can do this, right? But the people who do that tend to find funding and they tend to find their community, right?
I think as we wrap up, it would be interesting to hear what Dr. Barinholtz has to say, because he's also got this sort of theory and things that he's working on, and he's gotten it out on multiple different outlets.
Maybe a case in point. I mean, I'm not a great case study because I'm sitting in a cushy tenure position, and so on the one hand, I'm not worried about sort of kind of paying the bills and things like that. But I think what we're talking about here, and I want to sort of bring it all together in some ways, is like there's sort of a tragedy of the commons kind of problem. Like almost every when so just to pivot, I'm writing about stuff now that it's not quite ready for even full-fledged publication, and I'm publishing almost entirely on Substack, and then I post stuff and some videos like I did theories.
Or you go on Kurt's channel and get over 100,000.
And by far, I've had far greater impact than I had in my entire academic career, with whatever whatever accolades I received there and tenure and all that stuff. The truth is that people are actually really interested in a lot of things that aren't inherently fundable per se in the traditional scientific sense. Maybe too early, maybe too speculative. Doesn't necessarily or fundable in the private sector. And what we're dealing with, though, is there's a clear realization, I think everybody here in this room And I promise you, everybody here knows a bunch of people like them who, if they sat around, they would share this opinion that there's this deep sense that there are brilliant people with brilliant ideas who could be contributing, and that there is just a mismatch between even what generally or organically people actually do want. People want these speculative ideas people want at least one person, 10 people to be working on these things, even if they're not quote unquote fundable, because they think that would be a good allocation. Now, back in the day, this is what taxes were for, right? This is what the government's for. It's like everybody collectively wants this, ideally, right? That's sort of what democracy is supposed to be. Everybody collectively wants this, but we have to make it taxes, because at the individual level, it's very hard to solve the problem of how do we fund it, because each person's like, yeah, I'd like to cure cancer, but I'm not going to be, my dollars aren't going to be the ones to cure the cancer. But collectively, if I chip in, I don't have enough money to cure cancer, but if I can give $10, a year to cancer research, then I kind of agree to that. And here's what I want to pose to this group, because it's a pretty extraordinary group of people already. And I think collectively, if you think about who everybody here knows, and how can we think about novel solutions? We live in a radically different time than certainly than I did when I was growing up, and then the previous generations, in terms of the decentralization of how money flows, of how ideas flow, how people, you can vote on stuff that ideas can go viral very quickly. All these kinds of things were outside the realm of possibility. I don't DVZ is we've talked a bit about, like, decentralized science. Are there radical kinds of possible solutions to looking at how we fund? Because that's really, in the end, a lot of this comes down to people are just they want to survive and do this really, really interesting stuff. They don't necessarily need to do a unicorn startup, but they need enough to be able to not pursue other perhaps less meaningful to them and less meaningful to society ventures. Are there ideas that maybe we could even try to incubate, or at least discuss in this kind of group or elsewhere, and maybe even run some of the social experiments, if we can call them that? If you had a certain amount of money that gets distributed into some sort of credits, then everybody votes somehow as to whose research or something ends up going there collectively, right? More like a democracy of sorts. Is that a way, or something more like a crypto exchange, where certain kind of sort of value of certain research somehow rises by virtue of the markets, or something like that. So I just want to throw out here, I certainly don't have a solution and wouldn't claim to, but I do see enormous potential. I see just to come back to my own personal experience, I see how hungry people are, even for philosophy, right? We're starting computational philosophy is incredibly unfundable, right? And that's the reason why philosophy is dying in academia, because it doesn't bring in grants. Because all you need, what are you going to put in? A grant for an armchair and a pipe, right? I mean, you're thinking it doesn't cost anything. So universities hate it, right? Because they don't get their overhead for it, right? So, but yet I see there's this massive a response, much more so, as I said, than to any of my actual published scientific results. People are, I think lives are even being changed. I'd venture to say by some of these conversations. And the question is, how do we take that collective goodwill that what I can see as this organic desire for all kinds of interesting but untraditional models, not necessarily fundable kinds of science. Are there other models that really kind of goodwill and also inspired and brilliant people can come up with? There are just so many possibilities that exist now that never existed before. So I would like to, for people, I don't want to end the conversation, but that's maybe a way we could continue this kind of conversation, is to really think about, at the meta level, how do we do this thing that everybody here wants and that millions of people want, but that sort of like a tragedy of commons style, it doesn't really get done.
Niko, your
Okay.
thought.
I don't know if that was for you, but yes.
Yeah, I don't have any ideas. I think a lot of Like, I guess I can only speak for myself. Like one of the reasons I like doing Asimov Press is because I get to work with other writers and I hear ideas, and that's the best part of being an editor. But when I started as a writer, of course, the default is I'm just going to do it by myself and write whatever. But I think it has made me a better person to be part of a collective. But I don't know how to change people's thinking on that. So I don't have great ideas other than the experiments that I sort of encounter in my job. Like things like the Experiment Foundation is raising money to fund experiments. And, there's so many interesting things out there. But yeah, I don't know how to cohere them into something greater.
Let's see
I
if
will,
we.
s- I,
Yeah,
I
let's
will say
take one more easy before we wrap it up.
it's not a question so much as if people are interested in the question of how do we solve the market failure. I mentioned it. My main work with the Wolfram Institute is studying this question and whether or not decentralized science might be the solution. And we have a Discord where we talk about these things regularly, and we have community calls every 2 weeks. So if someone is really excited about the question Alon asked, I'm about to throw a link in the chat, and they're welcome to join that community. And we'll have community calls every couple of weeks, and they can ask questions in the Discord. And I'm really trying to get a little community going who's very interested in this question of this market failure in science and how.
Yeah, just to plus one of that, I went last week and it's good, and I'm very excited about the project. So maybe that can be sort of an initial focal point for us to discuss ahead.
Cool. All right. This was a wonderful time. I'm really glad we got to have this conversation. I think it should be something we have a bit more often because it's very much the engine that drives, or maybe it's not the engine, but it's the road that we drive on, that we use the engine on in a way. So anyways, pleasure. Thank you everyone, of course, for joining. Niko, if you have anything you'd like to plug, promote, I know you got a podcast or something you're cooking up.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. My computer's about to die, so my screen has gone black. But
Okay, yep, I can hear and see you. So let's wrap up real quick. Yep.
Nothing to plug. Thanks for inviting me. This was great. If anyone would like to keep talking, my email is just niko@asimov.com, and I'd love to set up a call with you and go deeper on anything that anyone's interested in.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Niko. You have a wonderful day. Thanks for your time, man.
Thank you.
Good stuff.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.